Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Sir, you mentioned something about a lower estimate, but I'm not clear about how that would go through. I mean, for example, if you take the function something like mod x, simply f of x is equal to x, let's say, which is, I mean, f of z is equal to
You mean f of z equal to z?
Yeah, yeah. So f of z is equal to z, then I mean,
Sorry.
I mean that will have a lower bound 0, obviously. The modulus of
Sorry. Maybe what I said is not quite correct. Lower bound, yeah, I really meant upper bound. Sorry. Um, yeah, suppose, but sorry, what I said does not quite prove. Yeah, I made a mistake. But suppose the lower bound is strictly positive, then what I said will work, I think. Suppose you take a holomorphic function whose lower bound is strictly positive. Yeah. Then 1 upon fz is a holomorphic function which will be bounded above. And therefore that will be constant. So fz will be a constant.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So of course, I hope people understand this is another illustration, one more illustration of how complex analysis is so different from real analysis. In real analysis, you have so many functions, differentiable functions, even infinitely differentiable functions, even analytic functions which are bounded, right? Sin x, cos x, sine of cos x, cos of sin x, all sorts of functions are bounded. None of that happens in complex analysis. Moment the entire function is bounded, it is constant. Yeah. The same function sin x, when I think of it as a complex variable, it becomes unbounded. And likewise for anything else. Okay. Now let's give our first proof of fundamental theorem of algebra. So recall that the fundamental theorem of algebra asserts that every non-constant polynomial with complex coefficients has a complex root. Now let's give a proof of this theorem using Liouville's theorem. So first, we will show that mod fz tends to infinity as mod z tends to infinity. This is the first thing I want to prove. This is very believable, of course, that as z becomes larger and larger, fz should become larger and larger. But let's give a rigorous proof. If fz is equal to a0 plus a1z plus a2z square plus dot dot a n z to the n, then mod fz is equal to take mod z to the n outside, and you have this. This is greater than or equal to mod z to the power n. The term inside the bracket can be replaced by mod an minus mod of the remaining sum of the remaining terms. I'm using the inequality that mod of a plus b is bigger than or equal to mod a minus mod b. So here my a is an and b is the sum of all the other terms. So I can replace the term inside the bracket by mod an minus mod of the rest of the sum. But as mod z tends to infinity, this a0 by z to the n plus a1 by z to the a0 by z to the n plus a1 by z to the n minus 1 plus dot 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 plus an minus 1 by z, this modulus will tend to 0. And hence the above inequality, and hence the above quantity clearly tends to infinity because you have mod z to the power n outside. The term inside the bracket will converge to mod an because the second term goes to 0. So it's mod of z to the power n into mod an. This will go to infinity as mod z tends to infinity. So this whole thing is, so mod fz tends to infinity as mod z tends to infinity. Is this much clear so far?
Yes, I think that's fine.
So fz, we have proved that mod fz tends to infinity as mod z tends to infinity. Now suppose fz does not have any 0. Then 1 upon fz defines a holomorphic function which by the above computation is bounded, and hence by Liouville's theorem it is a constant, which is a contradiction, right? Suppose fz does not have any 0, then you agree that 1 upon fz defines a holomorphic function. Ratio of two holomorphic functions, denominator is never 0, then so holomorphic function. So 1 upon fz is holomorphic, but by above computation this is a bounded function. Because as z becomes larger and larger, this tends to 0. So whatever is the value taken in a large disk is the maximum value. Because outside the large disk, the value is anyway small. So the maximum value inside a large disk is the maximum value that 1 upon fz will attain. So it's a bounded function. So therefore by Liouville's theorem, it is constant. This is a contradiction.
Sir, what exactly is a contradiction? I'm not getting.
No, contradiction is that finally we have proved it's bounded. We started with an, so contradiction is that it's constant. By Liouville's theorem, we finally concluded it's constant. 1 upon fz is constant, that means fz is constant. But we started with a non-constant polynomial.
Could you elaborate on the disk part again? Like,
So I have proved that you agree that 1 upon f, the modulus of 1 by fz tends to 0 as mod z tends to infinity, right?
yes.
Yeah. So that means, suppose for example, eventually suppose outside some large disk, the value is less than 1 upon million, for suppose, outside some large disk. Then the maximum of value of 1 upon fz will be the maximum value outside the disk and the maximum value inside the disk. Take the maximum of those two. But the maximum value outside the disk is very small, so the maximum value will be attained inside the closed disk. But whatever maximum value inside the closed disk is some bounded number.
So here we are also using the fact that holomorphic function on a compact set is bounded.
Yeah. I didn't want to introduce compact, etc. But yes, I am using that. But just to keep things simple, I didn't say that. Yeah. On a closed, I'm using the fact that on a closed disk, a function is always bounded. So, for example, just to elaborate, in case there is any doubt. So let's take the case where a0 is equal to 1, suppose. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So let's assume a0 is 1. You can always divide and make a0 1. So outside some large disk, the value of 1 upon fz will be less than 1. When choose a large disk, so that 1 upon modulus of 1 by fz outside that large disk is strictly less than 1. Agreed? But inside that large disk, the maximum value is actually more than 1, because already at 0 it is equal to 1. So the maximum value inside the whole complex plane is going to be attained inside the closed disk. And we know that holomorphic function on some closed disk is going to be bounded. So whatever the bound is the bound for 1 upon fz over the entire complex plane. Yeah, clear? Any doubts? This is an important theorem, so do ask any doubts. So finally, the conclusion is that we have proved 1 upon fz is a constant by Liouville's theorem. So fz is a constant. That contradicts the assumption that we started with a non-constant polynomial. Yeah, can I go ahead?
Yes, I think you can.
Yeah, do go through it slowly and ask me later if you have any doubts. The proof is quite easy and sort of almost an immediate consequence of Liouville's theorem. Okay, now I'll just make a definition and couple of related remarks. A continuous function from C to C is said to be proper if mod fz tends to infinity as mod z tends to infinity. Equivalently, f is proper if it is continuous and inverse image of a bounded set is bounded. There is another way of defining proper. One definition is that mod fz tends to infinity as mod z tends to infinity. Equivalent definition is inverse image of a bounded set is bounded. Because if inverse image of a bounded set is unbounded, that means you can find a sequence of points going to infinity whose image is bounded. That will contradict the first statement. So the two statements are equivalent.
So can you explain the second statement again? What do you mean by inverse image of a bounded set is bounded?
So if I take some subset in the complex plane, then I can take its inverse image under f, right? Inverse image is just taking inverse of that set. Look at all points which go inside whose image goes inside that set. That's called inverse image. Anyway, never mind the second statement. Just take the first statement if you like. Continuous function from C to C is said to be proper if mod fz tends to infinity as mod z tends to infinity. That is also enough. Then we just now showed that non-constant polynomial functions on C are proper. That is what we just now proved. That one important class of such examples are polynomial functions, non-constant polynomials. Now, what is interesting and less obvious is that even the converse is true. Any proper holomorphic function from C to C is necessarily a non-constant polynomial. We won't prove this theorem, but this is an important theorem, so I thought I'll at least state it. Any proper holomorphic function from C to C is a non-constant polynomial.
Does inverse have to exist for every single point in C for a proper function?
No, inverse means what does inverse mean?
Inverse image for every point must have an inverse image for a proper function. Is it necessary?
No, every subset has an inverse image. So I think there is some confusion about what inverse image means. If I take a subset inside the complex plane, what does inverse image mean? Suppose I have a subset S inside C. What is inverse image of, what is F inverse of S? F inverse of S simply means you take all points in C whose image lands inside S. That is what you mean by inverse image. So inverse
For
image,
a proper function, is it necessary for every set to have an inverse image?
nothing to do with proper. For every function you can talk of inverse image. Simply take all points whose image lands inside S.
For example, if fz is 1 upon z, then any set 0 does not have an inverse image in this one.
Yeah, but that's empty. I mean, empty set is also allowed. Okay, so this is a striking theorem again, that any proper holomorphic function from C to C is necessarily a non-constant polynomial. So proper functions are of tremendous importance in various areas of mathematics, such as analysis, topology, algebraic geometry, etc. So we just now proved that polynomial functions over the complex numbers are surjective. Right? Every polynomial function from non-constant polynomial function from C to C is surjective. That is what fundamental theorem of algebra said. It has a zero, but saying that every polynomial has a zero is same as saying it is surjective. Because if you want the fz to attain the value alpha, then you just want to say that fz minus alpha has a root. So saying that every polynomial has a root is the same as saying that the polynomial function is surjective. Similarly, sine, cos, and various other elementary functions are surjective. On the other hand, e raised to z is not surjective, it misses 0. And a striking result here is that any entire function whose image misses the origin is of the form e raised to gz for some entire function gz. So exponential function misses the origin, and not only that, anything which misses the origin is of the form e raised to some analytic function, e raised to some entire function.
Gz does not necessarily have to be a polynomial.
No. E raised to gz, if I take any entire function gz, e raised to gz will never attain 0, right? Because it is e raised to something, so it will never attain the origin. And conversely, if it never attains the origin, it is of the form e raised to gz. Gz is just entire. So here is a sketch of the proof. The details are beyond us. So let fz be any entire function which misses the origin. If it misses the origin, then it defines a map from C to C star, right? The image goes inside C star. Now there's another map from C to C star, namely the exponential function. One has this natural map P from C to C star given by the exponential function. So here is the situation. You have this horizontal map, which is our given function, C to C star. You have the vertical map, which is the exponential function, Z goes to e raised to Z. Now one can show, this is what I'm not going to prove. One shows that there exists a holomorphic map, which is called a lift, say G, which goes from C to C, so that P of Gz equal to Fz. So one can show that there exists a map, this dotted arrow G, from C to C, so that G composed with the exponential function is equal to Fz. Yeah, this is the part I'm not proving, but one can prove that this exists. This requires some work. I'm just giving an idea of the proof. And once you do that, you are done, because hence f is equal to e raised to gz. G is not unique, but it can be altered by a multiple of 2 pi I. If one G works, G plus 2 pi I will also work. So this is the idea of the proof. Thus also, any non-surjective holomorphic function from C to C is of the form e raised to gz plus C for some I should really say entire function gz and some constant C. Entire function, analytic function, all are the same now. So it is anything which is not surjective is of the form e raised to gz plus C. Because if it is not surjective, then I can add some constant and assume that it does not attain 0. If it does not attain some number, then by adding a constant, I can assume that it does not attain 0. 0 is the number that it does not attain. Once it does not attain 0, it is of the form e raised to gz. Any doubts?
There can't be more than 1 point which it can't attain.
That's a good question. So that's a much deeper theorem. That is called the Picard theorem, which I will come to later. That's a much harder theorem, which I'm going to state later. Actually, that what you're saying is correct, but that's a difficult theorem in complex analysis, that an entire function cannot miss more than 1 point unless it is constant. But that's a difficult theorem. Maybe at the end of the course, if there is interest, I could give some separate lectures on it, but it is way beyond the scope of this course. But that's a correct statement, that it cannot miss more than 1 value. But a very difficult theorem to prove. So right now I'm not discussing that claim, which is although it is correct, only sketching the proof that if it is not surjective, it is of the form e raised to gz plus some constant. Okay, so this was the idea of the proof. So exponential function comes up is a very important function, because this tells you that moment a function is not surjective, it is of the form e raised to something up to a constant. It shows you how important exponential function is, and that's why we spent some time on it. Yeah, so I go ahead. So now let's revisit the logarithm. I mentioned I think in the previous lecture or the one before that we will revisit the logarithm after we have discussed complex integration. So now it's time to revisit the logarithm. So we will always consider log to the natural base here. So we had introduced the logarithm in the earlier lectures more as a pointwise operation. So let me recall that. So if you take a complex number r e raised to I theta, suppose this is a non-zero complex number, then log of r plus I times theta plus 2 pi n are the various values of log z. All these serve as logarithms of z, because if you exponentiate this, if you take e raised to log r plus I times theta plus 2 pi n, you will get z. Yeah, so log has many values. We would like to define log of r plus I times theta to be the principal value of log z. So this is fine. You can define it for a complex number this way. So there is, however, a problem with this when we try to define this as a holomorphic function on C star. So what we discussed about log so far was logarithm of a complex number. But now when we try to define it as a holomorphic function, even on C star, on C there is no chance because log of 0 is not defined. But even on C star, if you try to define it, there is a problem. So I want to first explain the problem and then explain how we get around it. So for instance, let's take the unit circle and let's look at the values of natural log assumed on the unit circle. So let's take, this is the unit circle, and let's look at the values of log for points on the unit circle. So let's go in the anti-clockwise direction. When z is equal to 1 on the x-axis, log is 0. Then let's take the principal values of log around the circle. So then as the angle increases, it is I pi by 8, then I pi by 4, then I 3 pi by 8, then I pi by 2, then I 3 pi by 4, then I 5 pi by 4, I 3 pi by 2, I 7 pi by 4, then I 15 pi by 8. And now as you start approaching 0, when you complete the circle and you start approaching 0 again, you see that it approaches very close to I times 2 pi. So as you see from the figure, after coming full circle, the value of log increases by 2 pi I. Right? When you go around the full circle. Yeah, I'm just writing down the primitive values of log and looking at looking at the primitive values of log at points on the unit circle. So when you go full circle, the value of log has increased by 2 pi I. It is 15 pi by 8, then it will be even closer to 2 pi I, even closer, and so on. So as you approach 0, it will be very close to 2 pi I. So this is the problem. When you try to define log and you go around the circle, the value of log has increased. So should I define it as 0 or should I define it as 2 pi I? That is the question. So in fact, there is no way of that one can define log as a holomorphic function on C star, and this is true about many other domains as well. Yeah, is this clear? Is this clear what I'm trying to explain? The difficulty in defining log. Yeah. Can somebody?
Yes, I think it's fine. It's clear.
Yeah. So this is the difficulty. You cannot define log on C star and many other domains. So once again, simply connectedness comes to our rescue. So we have the following theorem. So theorem, let omega be a simply connected domain in C with 1 belonging to omega and 0 not belonging to omega. Then there exists a unique holomorphic function fz on omega denoted as log z, such that f of 1 is 0, f prime z is equal to 1 by z, all the properties that of log that you want, e raised to fz is equal to z, and fz is equal to log r when r is a positive real number close to 1. So this holomorphic function that we defined is going to coincide with the usual log on the real axis, with the usual definition of log for real numbers. So this is the theorem. So I'll keep it for half a minute. Yeah. So the problem in the previous case was that C star was not simply connected. If you restrict yourself to simply connected domains, you can uniquely define logarithm satisfying all the three properties. So why am I saying, so in the third statement, why am I saying where r is a positive real number close to 1? Why is it important to say close to 1? Because omega is some simply connected domain and 1 belongs to omega. So all real numbers close to 1 belong to omega. Omega may not contain all the real numbers. That is why I cannot say that fr is equal to log r when r is if any positive real number. I have to impose, I can only say r is a positive real number close to 1 because only positive real numbers close to 1 may be there in omega.
What do you mean by close to 1? Limit?
No, Mr. Fisher, there is a neighborhood of 1 which is contained inside omega.
But if omega is big enough, we can have it fr equal to log r for any real number, right?
That's true, but right. Omega may not be that. Yeah. That is true, but omega may not be that large.
Right.
That is why to state the theorem, generally I have to state it this way. So just to pick on this last point, so can somebody give an example of a simply connected domain which contains all the non-zero real numbers? It should not contain 0, but it should contain all the non-zero real numbers and it should be simply connected. Can someone give an example?
The complex plane, except you remove the ray that goes from 0 to I and onwards.
So the positive y-axis, right?
Yeah. So you exclude 0 and the positive y-axis.
Correct. Good. So you just exclude 0 and the positive y-axis. Then that is a simply connected domain. It still remains connected. So it's a domain. It's an open set. So it's a domain and it is simply connected still. And this simply connected domain does contain all the non-zero real numbers. And in that case, if omega is of that kind, then actually fr will be equal to log r for all the positive real numbers. For all the real positive, yeah, for all positive real numbers. For negative real number, yeah. So is the theorem clear? Proof is going to be easy. The main thing is to understand the theorem.
Like this only a notational issue, but wouldn't it have been easier to just write for any positive real which is an element of omega?
Yeah. For any positive real number contained in omega. Yeah, that's another. Yeah, I could have just said it like that. That's correct. So maybe I'll write it that way. When I'll just send the slides over again, and then I'll just write it that way. But the proof is going to be easy. So since 1 belongs to omega and 0 does not belong to omega, so proof, since 1 belongs to omega and 0 does not belong to omega, define the function fz to be integration 1 by w dw from 1 to z. So this is how I want to define my fz. After all, the derivative of log is going to be 1 upon z. So the function that you are defining, log should be defined as an integral of 1 by z, right? So I should define it as integral 1 by w dw from 1 to z. Since omega is simply connected, it follows by Cauchy's theorem that this function is well defined. Integral does not depend on the path, so this function is well defined. we have seen before that this defines a holomorphic function on omega. Clearly, f of 1 is equal to 0 because then you would be integrating from 1 to 1. So f of 1 is equal to 0 and f prime z is equal to 1 by z. Because you're integrating 1 by z. So when you differentiate, you're going to get 1 by z. So again, something we have seen. So f prime z is equal to 1 by z. This proves 1. To prove 2, what is 2? 2 is that e raised to fz is equal to z. That means this fz that we have defined, this is like the inverse to the logarithm, inverse to the exponential function. So how do you prove 2? Just check that the function z e raised to minus fz has derivative identically vanishing and hence is a constant. What is derivative of z e raised to minus fz? It is e raised to minus fz plus, so just differentiate this, you'll get e raised to minus fz minus f prime z into e raised to minus fz. So this is e raised to minus fz minus, yeah, so okay. So just use the product formula. So it is derivative of z times, so 1 times e raised to minus fz plus z times derivative of e raised to minus fz. So that means z times e raised to minus fz into f prime z. But f prime z is equal to 1 by z. So you just get e raised to minus fz. So you get so you get e raised to so you just get e raised to f, so you get e raised to minus fz minus e raised to minus fz. Is this okay? So that is 0. Just a simple check that the derivative of this from definition just vanishes identically. It is e raised to minus fz minus z times e raised to minus fz times f prime z. So z will cancel and you will be left with e raised to fz minus e raised to minus f. You will be left with e raised to minus fz minus e raised to minus fz. So that is 0. So the derivative vanishes identically and hence this is a constant. So what constant is it? To know the constant, to compute the constant, just substitute z equal to 1. So this is e raised to minus f of 1. F of 1 is 0. We know that. So this is e raised to 0, which is equal to 1. So substituting z equal to 1, we see that this constant is equal to 1. So this proves 2. So that means z e raised to minus fz is equal to 1. So e raised to fz is equal to z. Is this clear? So this is easy. So this proves 2. For proving 3, well, that's again obvious because just take a straight line joining 1 and r for a small real number r. Then f of r is equal to integral from 1 to r 1 by t dt. But we know that this is equal to log r. From our calculus we know that 1 by t integral 1 by t dt from 1 to r is equal to log r. So this proves 3. 3 was that f of r coincides with log r for real numbers close to 1. That is indeed the case.
A logarithm for real numbers is not defined for negative numbers.
Sorry, why?
Log of minus 2 is not defined.
I mean, it's defined as a complex number. It's not defined as a real number. So you see, in statement 3, you only want to check that this function that you are defining coincides with the usual value of log for real numbers, for positive real numbers.
Okay, we don't care what happens when r is a negative real number.
So then there's nothing to check because this is the only way you have defined it. For positive real numbers, you already had another definition. So now you want to check that this definition coincides with the old definition. So the proof is really simple. There is nothing to the proof. Now I claim that such a function is unique. Can somebody explain why this is unique? I claim that the function satisfying these 3 conditions has to be unique.
Suppose we had 2 functions that satisfy these conditions, then they agree at 1. And 1 is an interior point of the domain. So the functions have so their difference function has to be 0 at 1 and 1 is an interior point. If and also they are agreeing at all small r's close to 1. So there also it would be 0, and we have seen that zeros should be discrete.
So it's not so much about agreeing at 1 that is important, but they agree
the
at
difference of the derivative of their difference is 0.
Yeah. So they as you say, suppose I have another function satisfying all these properties, then take the difference of those 2 functions. That will also be a holomorphic function, and it will vanish on all the positive real numbers close to 1. So since it vanishes on a set of points having a limit point, it will be identically 0. So the difference will be identically 0, and therefore the two functions will coincide. Yeah, so again we have used the same fact, two holomorphic functions on a domain which agree on a set which has a limit point inside omega, agree everywhere. This completes the discussion on the logarithm. So this is such a thing is called a branch of the logarithm. Whenever you have a certain domain, simply connected or not, doesn't matter. Suppose you have some domain on which you have a well-defined logarithm, then you call that function a branch of the logarithm. So this definition we made last time. So now I'll end with the exercise, which I would really like you to try. So let f be an entire function such that there exists a real constant c, such that for all z in C, mod fz is less than or equal to c times z to the power n. Then fz is a polynomial of degree less than or equal to n. Yeah, anything which increases like a polynomial has to be a polynomial. Morally, that's what the exercise is saying. Okay, so this completes the discussion. I will stop the recording.